It's Tuesday, the 21st of March. You're watching TIT TV Politics with me, Rob Double, and here's what's coming up on the programme. To discuss the week's political news, Lib Dem Peer Lord Newby and Policy Exchange's Amy Gray. Ringside seats in the fight between Unite, Momentum and the Parliamentary Labour Party, with Matt Pound from Labour First. Dr Connal Parr on the death of former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McGuinness. And Fiona Twycross explains London's concern at the government's schools funding formula. Let's start first with the news this week, the big news that Theresa May is going to trigger Article 50, the official process of leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. So that's next Wednesday. Lord Newby, in terms of where the Lib Dems are going to go now, obviously the legal challenges are over, the High Court rulings have been done, the Commons rebellions have happened and have not, borne much fruit. Where now are the Lib Dems planning to go in terms of Brexit?
Well, there are two strands. First of all, there's what's going to be happening in Parliament. We're going to have the Great Repeal Bill and lots of other bits of legislation, some of which are going to be very contentious, like the new immigration system that the government's going to have to set up. So we're going to be looking at all that and scrutinising it. More generally, we're fighting a campaign on the doorsteps on the basis that the people should have the final say once we know what the deal is. That was one of the things we were arguing in Richmond Park by-election. We'll be doing it at court and we'll be doing it whenever we get the chance to try and persuade people. You
mentioned the by-election issues there. How threatening do you think the Lib Dem campaign machine will be in particularly heavy Remain areas? Obviously you mentioned what happened in Richmond, Remain areas for both Labour and the Conservatives in the upcoming election, upcoming by-elections.
Sure. Well, we were slightly surprised, or I was very surprised in the autumn when we started at Witney in the by-election there, asking people to vote for us on the basis of the health service and the bus services, and they said, never mind all that, what do you think about Brexit? And so we found then at Richmond it was a very, very big issue. The Gorton by-election in South Manchester, which is happening at the beginning of May, is our first chance to see what happens in a heavy Remain area, which is a Labour area. We're getting a good response so far, but we won't know till we've tested it out.
And in terms of, you mentioned you're going to be looking to do a heavy amount of scrutiny through what's coming through Parliament. Is there a consensus in the Lib Dem party that where the Lib Dems can do its best work is in the Lords, where it has the numbers, as opposed to the Commons, where, to be quite frank, the numbers just aren't there to really make a big difference?
Well, it's very difficult for my colleagues who are in the Commons, because there are only 9 of them, and the rules of the Commons don't give them much opportunity. In the Lords, there are 100 of us, and we can, with Labour and crossbenchers, deny the government of a majority. So the whole power basis in the Lords is different, but it does mean if we've got good ideas and can persuade other people, we can actually require the government to think again.
Amy, in terms of when Theresa May decided to trigger Article 50, obviously she had the mandate to do so far earlier than the 29th of March. What was her reason behind doing that? What was her motives? Was it out of necessity or was it strategic thinking on her part?
I think it's probably a bit of both. So the biggest necessity, I think, was planning. The civil service wasn't allowed to do any contingency planning during the referendum campaign or in the run-up to the referendum campaign. The Cameron government said, we don't want to entertain the possibility we might lose. So there was a lot to be done starting on June the 24th. An awful lot of mapping to be done.
Including 2 great big new departments to
Absolutely.
deal with.
Setting up new departments, recruiting those staff. Every single government department has had these massive spreadsheets. They've been entering all the detail of the different EU bodies that they all have relationships with, of different funding streams, of different legislation that's come from the EU that has an impact on us here in the UK. Now that, you can't do that overnight. You need time to do that, and the civil service has been working really very hard.
And in terms of what we're hearing from Europe at the moment, obviously we had Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the European Commission President, saying that he wants to effectively make an example of Britain, that the process will be so severe and so painful that it will dissuade any other nation from even thinking about leaving the European Union in the future. That's obviously very heavy rhetoric, but where's that going to meet reality? Do you think when we actually get to the negotiations, a lot of change will happen, a lot of movement will start happening between the two groups?
Yes, a lot of movement. And Jean-Claude Juncker's not the only person that has a voice. Actually, the EU's negotiating position will be determined by the other member states. And a lot of those member states are reasonably friendly towards Britain and see Britain leaving as a chance to reshape the EU so it works better. And we can't forget the French and German elections. So apart from the UK, France and Germany are the two other biggest contributors to the EU budget. France will definitely have a new president soon. There could be a new German chancellor by the autumn, and that could change everything. So really, we're sort of gazing into a crystal ball a little bit at the moment.
Lord Newby, in terms of where the Liberal Democrats are, you know, you do get a lot of criticism, and Tim Farron obviously gets a lot of criticism for that. He's perhaps being excessively pessimistic over Britain's chances in the negotiations, the time period of the negotiations, what we're going to get out of it in terms of trade deals when we leave the single market. Do you think that Tim Farron and the Liberal Democrats are perhaps going too far and seeming a little bit too ideological about where Britain is going to be post-EU?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we think, and I certainly think, that there is no way, whatever the negotiations bring, and I agree they'll be a lot more flexible than what Juncker's saying at the moment, Britain is going to end up poorer and less secure as a result of this process. And none of the details is going to change that. If you have that view, which I do and Tim does, our view is that it's best to try and avoid what we see as a very, very costly outcome for the country. And so I don't think we're going over the top. I think we're just expressing a view. And obviously, we're going to have to try and persuade people of it, but we'll see how things unfold, whether some of our fears are borne out as the negotiations go ahead.
Something Tim Farron has said in his conference speech is that he mentioned this: Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Marine Le Pen, Theresa May. This is the new normal, the new status quo, aggressive, nationalistic, anti-NATO and anti-EU. Do you think he perhaps went a bit far in terms of where he's putting Theresa May in a category, calling her aggressive, nationalistic, anti-NATO?
Well, I think that if you read the white paper, it is pretty nationalistic. It says that we've got the bravest armed forces, the best this, the best that. I mean, it's demonstrably not the case. It's very difficult to say that no other country's got any soldiers as brave as we have.
I've got two brothers in our armed forces,
yes,
so I'm afraid I'm going to say they are the best in the world.
I'm sure you are, but I'm sure every country says that. But I think the point that Tim is making is that we are becoming increasingly stridently nationalistic and saying we're the best. And he doesn't think that that's a good basis for making policy, and neither do I.
I mean, in terms of, Amy, you mentioned earlier on about the importance of the elections. There are some say that perhaps we're not even going to start the negotiations, even if we trigger Article 50 next week, before June, you know, in terms of formal talks. And even then we have the elections after that. So when do you think, you know, the EU and Britain are actually, UK are actually going to sit down and really thump out where the negotiations are going to start? Is it going to be as late as June, do you think?
It's hard to say because there are different levels at which those conversations are going to be had. So Donald Tusk has said that a sort of initial response will come probably in April, and there will then be a summit of European leaders probably in May where they will all get together and talk through things in a little bit more detail. But I think those conversations between, you know, the guy responsible for air service agreements in our Department for Transport and the European Union, those will start quickly because there's a lot of detail to be thrashed through. You can't just leave it to summits. A lot of it is very unromantic, happens in small windowless rooms, you know, people shuttling back and forward across the channel. So on that level, it will begin very quickly.
Okay, well, we'll have a couple of years to find out, I suppose. But let's go on to our next story of the week, which is, of course, about what's happening in the Labour Party. And we're joined on the line by Matt Pound, who's a national organiser for the group Labour First. Matt, thanks for coming on the programme.
Thank you. Cheers.
Just give us your understanding of what's going on in the Labour Party at the moment.
Well, I think it was quite a revelation at the weekend. I mean, in terms of the sort of secret recording that came out over the weekend, it sort of confirmed what we've thought for a very long time, which is that now even the people closest to Jeremy Corbyn have given up on him. They're already planning for his successor, and that is their main focus. They're not interested really in helping Jeremy Corbyn lead or doing anything with him. They're just looking to see who can take over.
I mean, in terms of who's the driving force behind this, you know, as Tom Watson said, a plot to destroy the Labour Party as a force through this connection with Unite and the Momentum group. Who do you see as the real person who's playing, playing behind the scenes to make this happen?
Well, I think John McDonnell is the one who wants to take over the Labour Party. There's no doubt about that. He's basically one of the main archetypes, architects behind Corbynism and what we've seen recently in the party. He has run for leader twice before, and he knows that the only way that he's going to get back on is by reducing the threshold by the time we get to the party conference in September. He's heavily involved with Momentum, so I think between him and John Landsman, they're the ones who are sort of driving this.
I mean, how long have you been aware of this sort of secret plan to take over the Labour Party? How long have there been rumours flying around? Obviously, it came out this weekend through Tom Watson, but give us a timeline on this.
Well, I think suspicions were certainly raised right from day one when Momentum was created. I mean, they had a huge amount of data that they'd gained from the Jeremy Corbyn leadership campaign. And they always said that they were going to use this, new network of enthusiastic young people, mostly young people, to gain a bit of excitement about the Labour Party and for Labour policies and to support Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Now, there were certain cynical people among us right early on that didn't actually believe that that's what they wanted to use that data for. And actually 18 months down the line, we now have it in absolute clear terms from the horse's mouth that they are using that network to ensure that they get a left-wing successor to Jeremy Corbyn and not to support Jeremy Corbyn himself.
Just in terms of some quotes from Sky News, we had Peter Mandelson telling reporters the atmosphere in the party was like that of 1985, which is, of course, when the militant tendency attempted to take over the party. But then Lord Kinnock then subsequently told journalists, no, it's worse than that. I mean, in terms of the situation in the party as you read it, how bad is this?
Well, 1985 is a little bit before my time, but I think I mean it is the intentions are bad. I don't believe that they're making the headway that they were planning to. I think that that there are a lot of people who've been involved in the Labour Party for a very long time, who go down to meetings, who stand for officer positions, who go out campaigning, support their local councillors, support their local MPs. And actually, these are still the mainstream majority of people in the Labour Party. Yes, it is tragic, like that there is what I feel is like an existential group trying to come in and take over what is already, what I always found was already a fantastic sort of people's movement, that of the Labour Party. I mean, it's not a nice situation. It's very difficult for the PLP, who have basically had to be silent since the second leadership election, despite seeing what's going on in the party, despite seeing the polls plummeting week after week. They've remained silent because they know that they can't criticise Jeremy because they'll have these people on their back calling for their deselection.
OK, right, we're going to have to leave that there. Matt Pound, National Organiser for the group Labour First, thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Amy, in terms of the government's opportunity here, obviously Labour as a united force is in a bit of disarray. The PLP meeting last night gave quite, open revelations about that. Is there an opportunity here for the government to be pushing through things and implementing policies which it knows would be terribly unpopular if you had a united Labour Party in the opposite benches, but can get away with it now?
I think what we're actually seeing is almost the opposite happening. The Conservatives are sort of torn between desperately wanting Jeremy Corbyn to stay in place until 2020 and rubbing their hands with glee at the thought of him as an opponent, but also a real sadness that the country's official opposition is not working at the moment. So you saw after the budget a couple of weeks ago, the government subsequently changed its mind on national insurance contributions for the self-employed. It wasn't the opposition that caused the government to change their mind on that. It was the government's own backbenchers. And I think the danger for the government is that you have, Conservative backbenchers who know that the government has a small majority, only about a dozen that they can count on. And so it's Conservative backbenchers who are actually holding the government to account. Now, in some ways that's great. It means the government knows that they're being scrutinised. But it's not the job of a government's own party to do that. It's the job of the opposition, which isn't working at the moment.
In Lord Newby, if we take the assumption that Jeremy Corbyn's going to stay on as Labour leader until the next general election, there is, for many, an absence then of a centre-left party going into that election. Just how much do the Lib Dems feel that they could really capitalise on Corbyn's Labour Party at the next election?
Well, there's obviously a huge gaping void at the centre of British politics, and it's our job to capitalise on it. The only way you can do that in a democracy is to win votes in real elections. We've been doing well in by-elections. In the worst by-election result we've had since the referendum, we doubled our vote share, and we've picked up over 30 local council by-election gains in places like Rotherham and Sunderland and all over the place. So it's down to us. We don't know yet how successful we'll be, but we're really working very hard at it.
I mean, do you worry that being too anti-Brexit, being so clearly the party of the Remainers, is going to, when it comes to people at the general election looking for a centre-left alternative to what they can't find in the Labour Party, they would be flying to the Lib Dem vote, but the fact that you're so anti-Brexit will put off people who accept that Brexit needs to happen?
Well, there are 48% of the population voted against Brexit, which
That
is
doesn't necessarily mean
significantly
that
more
there's
than our
48.
current vote share. So there's quite a lot of scope for growth, let's put it that way. The other thing is that we're going to be winning votes, as we have in some of these Brexit-facing areas, on other policies. We're well down the road to having a very radical policy for long-term funding for health and social care. We'll be doing the same in policy areas. But when it comes to Brexit, we believe very strongly, as I say, that Britain's going down the wrong course. That's what we believe. And in politics, you know, and this is a problem with the Labour Party, sometimes you've got to, when you believe something, you've got to plan to flag in the ground and say, here I stand. And on Brexit, we're definitely going to keep standing round that particular flag.
Lord Newby, Amy Gray, don't go anywhere. We'll come back to you very shortly. We're looking in focus this week at the government's proposed changes to the national funding formula for schools and the impact this might have on schools, particularly in London. And joining me to talk about that is Fiona Twycross, who's the Deputy Leader of the Labour Group at the London Assembly. Fiona, thanks for coming on the programme.
Pleasure.
Just in terms of what the impact of this change would have on schools in London, just give us an idea of how significant this will be.
Well, over the national funding formula changes means that an additional £19 million is taken out of the funding of schools in London immediately. It's important to recognise that actually there's far greater impacts of government policy on schools. So in the first year of the changed formula alone, schools in London will lose around £360 million and are the worst affected of any part of the country in terms of the impact on schools. That isn't to say that other parts of the country aren't impacted, and I think it's really important to recognise that actually one of the main issues with this funding formula is the lack of funding going into it, not actually the formula itself. That was one of the things that came through very strongly at a recent education panel meeting at the London Assembly, that actually there's simply just not enough money being put in the pot.
I mean, the government says that these changes have been thought out carefully, or this change to the formula has been brought out to carefully balance the principles of fairness and stability. Now, you, of course, would you take issue with that?
I would. I think that we would have liked to see, rather than sort of penalise London for almost doing well. I mean, we had the London Challenge in London that made a massive difference to educational outcomes and life chances of some of our children from some of our most deprived backgrounds in London. And rather than say, let's replicate what the London Challenge programme has done in other parts of the country, they've actually just shifted money away from schools, which are really making a massive difference. And I think that it's also one of the most cynical things for me is about the way that the government appears to be pitting the rest of the country against London on this. But actually, I think some of the campaigning that's been done, including that of London councils, has really highlighted the impact on London, but actually the unfairness of the cuts overall and the potential damage that would be done.
I mean, in terms of the overall principle, the Department of Education said the school spending system as it stands is distributing money in a way that's unfair, opaque and outdated, and that this new national funding formula gives underfunded schools more cash, and these are schools perhaps which are outside London in particular, and more and it says more than half of England's schools will receive a cash boost. In principle, do you think that there does need to be a change in the way that schools are funded through a formula, so to make it more even and more equal across the country?
Well, the teaching unions that came to talk to the Education Panel at the London Assembly actually highlighted that in some ways there were necessary changes, but that the principal issue with the funding formula is that it disadvantages children that really need the help of the educational system to see them through. So the inner city schools in London are completely disproportionately affected, and of the 20 local authorities facing the largest reduction, 11 are in London, and virtually every single school in inner London will lose 1.5% in the coming financial year and 1.5% on average in the subsequent year. And these are schools that have benefited from additional investment. And I think that it's still true that unless you invest in education, you don't give children from the more disadvantaged backgrounds the opportunities that they deserve. And I think that we're getting hung up on the funding formula, but actually it's about the investment that the government is failing to make in education overall and in the life chances of children. And pitting London against the rest of the country like this helps muddy the waters, but actually at the end of the day, if they don't put enough money into the formula, they can have the best formula in the world, but it will still disadvantage schools.
I mean, but in terms of, someone might say, well, it's easy for London to pick up and kick up a fuss about this because London is doing incredibly well compared nationally in education, but receives, can argue, disproportionately benefited from the previous formula. So, for someone in, say, Derby, York or Torbay who would be benefiting from this changing formula, they might be saying, well, of course London's going to complain, or London schools are going to complain because they've benefited while we've lost out.
But it's about the overall amount of money that goes into the system. Why impact something that's working well? Why not look at what can be done to improve the finances of schools that need to be improved? And I think there's a particular issue that's been highlighted rightly about coastal schools. But why pit London and the success of London schools against the rest of the country? Why not actually step back and say, we're doing well in London, we want all children to have those opportunities, and look at finding extra ways of putting additional money into the pot rather than sort of running off and having vanity projects around grammar schools, for example, or having more free schools. Why not use that money into investing in children's futures? I think the priorities are wrong. You shouldn't undermine something that's working well. You should look at why it's working well and replicate that elsewhere rather than shifting money about. And we're talking about additional pupil numbers in classrooms. We're talking about schools potentially closing early as a result of funding cuts. These aren't going to have just marginal impacts in London. This is going to make very real differences to the life chances of some of our most disadvantaged children.
I mean, in terms of London inflammatory cost pressures, which are in schools, so a rise in the schools' costs, and a school of everything from national insurance costs to teachers' pay to the running costs of the schools. What's the impact on London? What's London going to be seeing come September in terms of the rising of inflationary prices?
I think London Councils has warned, and I think people campaigning on this issue have rightly warned that we could see sort of shortened school days. We could see schools having to make cuts to teacher numbers, and we could see results suffer as a result because at the end of the day, if you're not actually having the teacher hours, if you've got classroom sizes where it's difficult to pay attention to the children in the same way it is with slightly smaller classroom sizes, then exam results will suffer, and at every single stage of their school lives, children's education could potentially suffer as a result of these changes.
I mean, head teachers representing sort of 3,000 schools in England have written to their local MPs and ministers. There's been the reports this week. And one of the criticisms they've had is that the new funding formula does not offer meaningful solutions to current and future school finances. And obviously, it's easy to put holes in the current proposals. But in terms of what a meaningful solution would look like, in terms of, let's say, London, what would a meaningful solution be? What needs to happen in terms of education in London to prevent or to prepare for the future and provide something which is going to be future-proof?
Well, you've rightly pointed out that schools in London are doing a fantastic job. We do have the most amazing results that sort of demonstrate that state education can provide what children need. And in my view, it's simple. You just replicate what London's doing. You reward success rather than punishing success and shifting funding elsewhere for what can be seen to be slightly political manipulation of the funding that is available. And as I said, pitting London against the rest of the country on this isn't helpful, but it does mask the fact that actually this is about cuts to education and reduced funding within schools as much as it is about the national funding formula.
Okay, Fiona Twycross, Deputy Leader of the Labour Group at the London Assembly. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's talk now on the news which came in this morning about Martin McGuinness passing away. Joining us on the line is Dr. Connal Parr, who's an Irish political history academic at Northumbria University. Connal, thanks for coming on the programme.
Not a problem, thank you.
Just give us an idea, because there's been a lot of massively stark contrasts in the reaction from politicians and public figures to do with Martin McGuinness's passing this morning. What can you say to help us understand why he's got such a polarising response from particularly politicians?
Yes, I think part of the thing with Martin McGuinness is that he's a generational and a divisive figure. He's got a kind of Fidel Castro / Margaret Thatcher quality in that, and he's someone, because of his involvement in violence, he's got a kind of association which many people can't really separate from his later peaceful moves and the being involved in the reconciliation and the peace process and so on and so forth. It's very difficult for people to put behind Martin McGuinness's involvement in structured violence and the seriousness of the violence that he presided over as officer commanding of the Derry Provisional IRA. People said that the bombing campaign was so severe in Derry city centre that it looked as if it had been hit from the air. So what you also have with McGuinness is this later persona as a peacemaker, and I think that what's key is that he's both. He's both. There's both paramilitary and peacemaker. There's a book about him by the late Liam Clark and Catherine Johnson called Martin McGuinness From Guns to Government, and that very well establishes McGuinness, I think. He's always talking to the British. They always feel they can do business with him, and he's always talking with an MI6 guy called Michael Oatley. So they've always got those lines to him.
I mean, in terms of where the role he played in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, we've had Tony Blair this morning saying Martin McGuinness was a formidable foe, but also made him a formidable peacemaker. And Sir John Major, he said a lot of blood was on his hands in the early part of his life, but he later played an important part in the peace process. Just how significant or how essential was Martin McGuinness to that Good Friday Agreement?
I think he was fundamental to it. He has this fascinating, extraordinary relationship with the Reverend Ian Paisley at the end of Paisley's life and at the end of Martin McGuinness's political journey. They are so friendly and so fond in their rapport with one another that they get dubbed within Northern Ireland the Chuckle Brothers. So they've got this kind of strange bond which builds up. It's these two extremes. On the one hand, Martin McGuinness as somebody who's a provisional IRA officer commanding, and Ian Paisley on the other as a guy who rouses a lot of loyalists towards acts of violence. And they have this extraordinary relationship at the end. What I would also say is that sometimes what I think people on the English mainland miss is that there's a strong sense that the peacemakers have to be former militants. They're people who are always going to be the ex-soldiers, the people who were formerly involved in acts of violence. We have this image of peacemakers as people sitting around a campfire, strumming a guitar and singing, "Make me a channel of your peace." In actual fact, it's when the militants engage and the paramilitaries engage, the men of violence engage and come to the table, the peace arrives.
Just in terms of the impact this is going to be having on Northern Ireland, obviously it's going through a challenging time at the moment with the power sharing agreement still being negotiated, and obviously we've got Brexit coming up in the next 2 years and the impact that might have on Northern Ireland politics. What do you see as Martin McGuinness's passing's impact on the way politics is going to continue in Northern Ireland? Is it going to have a profound impact, say, in allowing time to pass over what was a very difficult period for the region?
I'm afraid, actually, my own reading of it is rather more pessimistic than that. If anything, Martin McGuinness was, as the peacemaker, holding, I think, a lot back within the Republican movement. He was the one making the conciliatory gestures, not just with Ian Paisley, but also with the Queen, shaking the hands of the Queen a couple of times, and having also a cordial relationship with her, was reaching out to the Unionist Protestant population of Northern Ireland. Now that McGuinness has stepped aside, which he did at the end of last year, we're seeing what has happened, which is that Sinn Féin have reverted to a kind of gridlocked, quite aggressive adversarial relationship with their political opponents. And I think that's intrinsically related to McGuinness's departure. So far from him actually being someone who, step by dying and giving way to a new generation, is actually giving way to a generation which is probably a bit harder and a bit hard-headed in terms of dealing with their opponents than Martin McGuinness was.
Okay, Dr. Connal Parr, Irish political history academic at Northumbria University. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Amy, in terms of Brexit, in terms of the Northern Ireland power sharing agreement, which is going through at the moment, do you think that something like this is going to have an impact? Obviously, we heard from Dr. Connal Parr that he's very pessimistic about Northern Ireland politics in the coming couple of years, in the coming generation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sad to hear that he's pessimistic. That's a shame. Would that we could all have a crystal ball and see that it's going to be all right. But I think there's been a lot of talk, particularly about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I'm relatively optimistic about that. Our common travel area that covers all of the British Isles, England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland as well, predates all of us joining the European Union. And so I'm reasonably optimistic, actually, that can continue. The Republic of Ireland never joined the Schengen area, for example. So the UK and Ireland have remained outside that. I think that's something really important to continue. And the Irish government has shown itself to be pretty open to talking about pretty much everything with the UK government.
Lord Newby, in terms of Brexit in Northern Ireland, what do you think is going to be the impact of that? Obviously, the UK government has made it clear that they want to maintain a soft border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Do you think that that's going to be a practical outcome? Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's just really wishful thinking?
Well, I slightly fear. My first job after university was working in customs and excise. So when people talk about customs, I'm one of the few politicians whose eyes slightly light up. The terrible thing about customs, differences in customs, is that things become immensely messy very quickly because it requires things to be checked. And the terrible problem, which is an intellectual and practical problem, is how can you have a soft border when you don't have a customs border, when you need to be checking stuff? And I don't think at the moment either the government, our government, or the Republic's government know quite how they want to do it. They know they do want to do it and make life as much as possible as it is now, but actually doing it when you're not part of the same customs area is just very tricky.
In terms of what's going to be the biggest headache for the government, or what's going to cause the biggest political problems, Scotland or Northern Ireland in terms of Brexit?
I think Scotland in terms of Brexit. I think that Northern Ireland, you've got two crises at the same time. You've got the crisis about the power-sharing executive, which has nothing to do much with Brexit at all, and then you've got Brexit. With Scotland, as we know, you've got the dominant political party wants the country to leave the UK, and that's a much more significant, longer-term problem in my view.
Okay, right, we've run out of time, but we're going to have to leave that there. So Amy Gray and Lord Newby, thank you very much for coming on the programme this week. Now, that's all the politics we've got time for this week, but don't forget you can find videos, comment and much more on our Facebook page and on Twitter @TipTVPolitics. Join me again next week for all the latest in the week's politics. Until then, from me, Rob Double, have a great week. Goodbye.
Thank you.